Democracies are fragile things. Many of us who pay attention have watched democracies rise and fall. So far, American democracy has survived attempts to weaken it, but no one can guarantee that it will continue to do so. Two of the pillars of democracy are a free press and an independent judiciary. Those pillars often are the first targets of world leaders who want to weaken their country's democracies and establish autocratic rule. It takes people with vision and courage to push back against anti-democratic forces and shore up the freedoms that we, the people, too often take for granted. Bob Cordy is one such person. A former public defender turned a federal prosecutor, turned a Republican governor's chief legal counsel, turned an associate justice of his state's highest court. Bob has become a go-to lawyer for foreign countries seeking to root out corruption in their court systems and keep their courts independent from the other branches of government. In the early 2000s, he was part of extensive but ultimately failed efforts at establishing judicial independence in Russia and Turkey, then helped lead a successful anti-corruption effort in the courts of Uzbekistan, and for the past few years has worked with an international team making great inroads at eliminating corruption in the courts of Ukraine. In the first half of this episode of Higher Callings, I asked Bob about how he advanced from his humble beginnings as a public defender ultimately to become a respected member of his state's highest court. In the second half of the episode, we talk about Bob's work overseas, the weakening of democracies around the world, the importance of preserving a strong, independent judiciary in our own United States, and the crucial role of lawyers in accomplishing that indispensable goal. I'm Don Frederico, and this is Higher Callings. Bob Cordy, thank you for joining me today. How are you today?
Pretty good. Happy to be here.
I really appreciate your joining me for the podcast. I've thought about adding you as a guest for quite a while, and the more I learn about some of the things you've been doing, the more excited I am about this podcast. And you're back in the States now. Were you gone for a little while?
I was gone last week to Poland, actually. I'm working with the Ukrainian judiciary, and we have been meeting mostly virtually, but we've had at least 3 meetings two in Poland and 1 in Vienna with the Ethics Council of the Ukraine and our staff.
You know, that's just fascinating work. And now that I've had a chance to familiarize myself with some of what you've been doing for a number of years now, I understand the context in which you were brought into that. And we're going to get into all of that later on in the podcast. So what I want to do is start by kind of going to the beginning, talking about your background, how you chose to become a lawyer, your focus on public interest, the public service, because you've been a public service lawyer most of your career. And I mean that in a very broad sense. You've been working in the public sector, but in very important positions. All of that leading, I think, now to your sort of post-judicial work. And for any of our listeners who don't know, one of the positions you held for a number of years was Associate Justice of the Massachusetts Supreme Court, known as the Supreme Judicial Court in Massachusetts. You left a very lucrative job and career to go do that for a long time, and that led to some of your experiences overseas that you're involved with now. But let me just stop there, and let me just start by asking you if you could talk a little bit about why you decided to go into law and why you were drawn to law that was really serving the public interest.
Well, I always wanted to be an engineer, aeronautical engineer, maybe an astronaut. Remember, this is the 1960s we're talking about. Nuclear energy. My father was an engineer. And So I thought that was my career path. And I went to Dartmouth College. And after the first year and experimenting in some other areas, I just decided that engineering wasn't really for me. But I was very interested in how do you improve society? Is it urban planning? How do you make a difference in how we live and how all of us live? And I thought I was going to go literally into urban planning. And then the gentleman who recruited me to go to Dartmouth College said, I want you to meet with someone. And he introduced me to a federal judge who had been a big Dartmouth football player back in the 20s and 30s. He was a judge in New York City. And he persuaded me that the law was a really important tool to societal improvement and that I should think about it seriously. And he really persuaded me that I should take a look, and I did, and got lucky.
So he convinced you to go to law school. You went to Harvard Law School. And while you were there, you started doing some work for criminal defendants.
Well, when I decided to go to law school, I really decided I wanted to be a trial lawyer. And I wanted to help people who needed help in that context. So this was before clinical programs really existed in law schools.
Yeah.
I joined the Harvard Voluntary Defenders, which was just a voluntary student organization. We had no faculty member, no faculty advisor. They gave us an office, a secretary, and $2,500 to hire a lawyer under whose license we could practice. No credit, nothing.
Wow.
But the student practice rules were a lot more lenient back then. The first 2 years, you couldn't actually appear in court on behalf of someone, but we worked on briefs in death penalty cases from the South. And by the third year, I became the president of the Harvard Voluntary Defenders. And I spent more time in court than I did in the classroom. And I was just loved every minute of it.
What kinds of cases were you seeing?
Well, I mean, mostly misdemeanor cases.
Yeah.
For example, someone was appointed to the Boston Municipal Court, a fellow named Gordon Dorfer, who was a prominent lawyer.
Right.
And he called me and said, Bob, I'm on the Boston Municipal Court, and we have just a bunch of front row lawyers that take cases for $10 and $15 a piece, and they resolve them right there. And I just don't think these people are getting very good representation. Do you think you could bring the Harvard Voluntary Defenders down and take cases here? And I said, yeah, why not? So we did. And again, they were prostitution cases, theft cases, really minor misdemeanor cases. But that was the business of the Boston court, and he really wanted to have some better representation. But we worked in the Framingham District Court. We worked in a lot of district courts.
And then what did you do after you graduated from Harvard?
Well, so my last year at law school was the 25th anniversary of the Harvard Voluntary Defenders, founded by Sam Dash back in 1949.
Wow.
And we had a big anniversary celebration, and Scott Harshbarger came to it.
Sure.
Scott had joined the Public Defender's Office in a managerial capacity to really try to create a modern Public Defender's Office. It was called the Mass Defenders Committee back at the time. And he decided he needed to recruit students, just like law firms recruited students, and he started recruiting at Harvard. I was totally taken by what he had to offer. He recruited me and about 4 other students out of Harvard Law School. And so when it came time to make a decision, I was fortunate enough to have offers from 2 major Boston law firms and a San Francisco law firm, where I had spent the summer between second and third years,
right,
and in the Public Defender's Office. And as Scott told me, our offer is contingent on funding. In other words, they would hire me and if they had the money.
Right.
And I accepted the job. My parents were stunned, turning down real good paying jobs for a maybe job at the Public Defender's Office. But it was the best decision I ever made.
Well, let's explore that a little bit. First of all, I should tell our listeners who don't already know that Scott Harshbarger then later became DA for Middlesex County, as I recall, and eventually became the Attorney General for Massachusetts.
Correct.
And then I think went into private practice after that at some point.
Mhm.
But so why was that the best decision? Why did you make that decision, and why do you consider it the best decision you ever made? And I'm sure you're limiting that to your professional decisions, not the decisions you've made in your personal life.
Well, it was a pretty important decision for lots of reasons.
Yeah.
Well, I knew what being in a courtroom was like, and I loved every minute of it. I really wanted to be a trial lawyer at that point. I wanted to be F. Lee Bailey all the way up until the time when we disbarred him. I just felt that I'd had the experience in San Francisco as a summer law clerk at one of the big firms there. And it was all very interesting, but it really did not appeal to me.
Yeah.
I wanted to be involved with people on the ground with results that I could really touch, feel, and appreciate. So the Mass Defenders looked like a great place to learn how to be a great trial lawyer. And I spent almost 4 years there, and I learned so much. I've never learned so much in my entire life. Hundreds of clients, 30 major felony jury trials, and a large number of jury of 6 misdemeanor trials. And it just was wonderful. It was the greatest experience one could have as a young lawyer.
Were you in both federal and state court?
No, Mass Defenders was just in the state courts.
Okay. And were they all criminal cases?
Yes.
Okay. So you did that for 4 years, and then where did you go from there?
Well, as I sort of appreciated the world around me, one of the things that was very apparent is that the people that were being prosecuted were largely poor people.
Yeah.
And the crimes were largely, street crimes and, robberies and things of that sort. And there was a whole mass of other crime out there in the white collar area that was not being touched. Prosecutors were, they joined the prosecutor's office to spend a couple of years for resume purposes and then take off. Investigators were not sophisticated. There were no teams of financial investigators. And I just felt that it was unfair. There was justice was being meted out to people who had no other alternatives, but to folks who were doing well and cheating the system some way. There was no way to make them accountable. And there was a corruption scandal at the Department of Revenue.
The Massachusetts Department of Revenue.
Massachusetts Department of Revenue. One of my colleagues at the Mass Defenders was very close to Governor Dukakis. And the governor asked if he would come over and set up an Office of Special Investigations within the Department of Revenue to not only investigate allegations of corruption within the department, but also to investigate tax crimes. There hadn't been a tax prosecution in decades. He asked me if I would come and set that unit up for him, with him, and we did. And it was an opportunity. It was amazing. We worked with the IRS, prosecuted probably in the first year 100 cases.
Wow.
It was fish in a barrel. I got called down to the federal grand jury on a couple of occasions because the feds, of course, were also investigating organized crime and their control of certain restaurants, which, of course, never paid taxes, never turned the money over to the state. So in any event, it was a great, very intense experience on the white-collar side.
And just to put it in time, this was during the first term of Governor Dukakis before he came back later, a few years later. Correct. So we're in the 1970s, right?
We're in the 1970s, really the last 2 years of the Dukakis administration, and I had eventually been promoted to the first deputy commissioner of the Department of Revenue, reporting to A&F and the commissioner. When Governor King was elected, he had a very different view, and I was getting uncomfortable with what he was trying to do with our unit. And so I got a wonderful call from Scott Harshbarger, who had just been appointed the general counsel of the newly formed State Ethics Commission, which was formed as a result of investigations and horrible corruption within the legislative branch. And he said, Bob, would you come over and set up an investigative and prosecution unit for the new State Ethics Commission. And I said, absolutely, timing is perfect. And so I joined and did that for 3 years. It was great.
And what kind of work did that entail, Bob?
Well, we had subpoena power. We could bring first of all, we were implementing the financial disclosure law across the state, and we could investigate violations of the financial disclosure law. The disclosures were not, we had audit capacity, et cetera. But largely my job was to hire investigators and lawyers and look at conflicts of interest, bribery, and other things going on within government. And it was a bit of a field day. Lots of stuff had just been overlooked, and we were able to get great informants and really start to make an impact and begin to change the culture of, we hoped, the culture of Massachusetts.
Yeah, that's great. How long were you there?
About 3 years. And Bill Weld was then appointed to be the U.S. Attorney, I think at the end of 1981.
Yeah.
He declared that public corruption was going to be his number one priority. And he then proceeded to try to recruit lawyers who had some experience in the field. Of course, there was the sort of the MBM Commission, the Special Commission on Corruption, that was was also working during that period of time, and there were a number of lawyers on that commission whom he hired, and then he hired me to come in and work on the public corruption side of his office.
So you moved from a state ethics commission
Yes.
to the federal U.S. Attorney's Office for the District of Massachusetts. You know,
Correct.
One thing that's kind of interesting as I listen to you and think about your path, which is similar to other people's paths in this sense. You had your champions. You know, you had Scott Harshbarger really kind of give you your start.
Yep.
And I'm sure lead by example, knowing what I do about Scott, and further inspire you and then give you a second opportunity. I'm sure he recognized the talent that you brought and the energy and commitment that you brought to your jobs. And then I know Bill Weld became sort of a champion of yours. And I know you and I understand that you and he became very close. In fact, I think you both ended up for a while at the same law firm many years later. But so it's important, I think, you know, if there's any younger lawyers or listeners out there or law students, it's important for them to understand that developing relationships with and proving yourself to people who might share the same values and have some pull professionally is never a bad thing, and
Nope.
it can give rise to somebody of tremendous talent and commitment and dedication to really have an opportunity to serve, which is what you've done all your life.
I was very lucky to have them as mentors and friends, and be in a position to hopefully prove myself.
Yeah, which you did very clearly. So how long were you in the U.S. Attorney's Office?
6 years.
Okay, and were you in the public corruption unit the whole time?
Yes, and I became the chief of the public corruption unit when Judge Mark Wolf became Judge Mark Wolf.
Okay.
He had overseen the corruption investigative unit, prosecution unit. He then became a judge, and Bill Weld asked me to take over as the chief of the public corruption unit.
Oh, that's great. Are there any stories you want to impart from your years in the public corruption unit? Any particular cases that you think our listeners might be interested in hearing about?
We brought a lot of cases.
Yeah.
We, of course, used our power of the grand jury to bring in people like developers from around the city to question them about bribery and other forms of corruption they may have run into. Many of them said, oh, no, everything was beautiful. Unfortunately for them, we had recruited a couple of sources within the government, and we had these same people on tape making payoffs. And so we would often walk the witness and the lawyer down to my office, show them the film.
Yeah.
But it was an extraordinary effort to change the culture. People knew this was wrong, but it was the way business was done, and there were no alternatives. I remember the sentencing of an architect who had committed perjury, and we had prosecuted him. At sentencing, he turned to me and he said, Bob, if I'd known you guys were really serious and weren't just going to go away, that this was just another political thing, I would have told you everything. But I thought if I did, I would never be able to do business in the city of Boston again. And that was the culture.
Because that's the way business was done in some circles. Yeah.
Exactly. And in the area of permitting, inspections, zoning, all of that, it was corrupt from top to bottom. Mm-hmm. So the whole goal was to change the culture by showing people that there was another way, that this was not acceptable, and they had an alternative. And of course, that takes years to develop that, to change that culture and get people thinking differently about their contacts with government and what that they should be. And I think we did, not over just 6 years, but over about 2 decades of work in the area. It completely changed the culture. Now, I've had many clients since then who were real estate folks, some of whom I'd had in the grand jury way back in the day. And they have all told me that everything indeed has changed.
Yeah.
So that makes me very, very proud.
It should. And it's good to hear, too, reassuring for those of us who live in Massachusetts to know that that's the case. Yeah, it was a different time. And I never had I never had sort of the inside view that you got as a prosecutor and on the Ethics Commission. But I remember I clerked for a federal judge in 1979 and 1980, and there were some corruption cases brought in front of him. And that was sort of my introduction to getting to see a little bit of that underside of Massachusetts business and politics kind of mixing. You and the other lawyers in the public corruption unit at the U.S. Attorney's Office accomplished a great deal. But personally for you, and in terms of developing your skills, what was that like?
Well, it was extraordinary. I mean, being in federal court, I had a number of big trials, which were terrific. So I certainly developed a lot more experience with the large white-collar trial as opposed to the street crime trial. I got along very well with the judges. I think they appreciated the work we were doing, and it was great. I was doing what I hoped to do, which is to begin to change the culture and to hold people accountable that should know better.
So then when did you leave the office?
I left in 1987. Funny story. I think it was a sentencing before Judge David Mazzoni. Mm-hmm. And Bob Popio was on the other side, very prominent, as you know.
Right.
It was sort of interrupted a big civil trial that was going on. And so the civil lawyers were all sitting in the jury box as this, sentencing argument was going on back and forth. And the next day, I got a call. As it turns out, Tom Burns was the lawyer involved in the civil suit. He had his associate, who knew me from Dartmouth College, call me and say, "Bob, Tom wants to know, are you interested in private practice at any point?" And of course, the timing could not have been better. We were having our 4th child, and it was time for me to take a step out of the public service field. Right. And I never looked anywhere else. Within a couple of weeks, I was at Burns and Levinson. And
that's I had forgotten about that whole part of your career, that you were at Burns and Levinson.
Well, I will tell you that Larry Levinson literally called me up to his office. I think it was the first day I showed up for work. And he said, "Bob, you may think that Tom Burns hired you to work for him. You work for me. I'm setting up a business litigation unit, and you're going to be part of it. But you work for me.
Is that how it played out? Did you do your work for him? Yeah. So were you doing? It was business litigation. Was it a mix of civil and criminal, or mostly one or the other?
A little bit of both. I mean, a little bit of tax stuff, of course, but I had a huge securities trial in front of Judge Skinner. It went on for 3 months. So it was a lot of business-oriented civil litigation and tax stuff sort of overlaid.
Yeah. How did you adjust to private practice as opposed after all those years in public practice?
Well, I had good partners. I enjoyed the trial work.
Yeah.
I wish I was in court more than I was, because, as you know, on the civil side, you don't get into court all that much,
especially these days. Yeah.
But it was important that I did it. I mean, to me, it did sort of broaden my areas of expertise and comfort, and so it was worth doing.
Good. How long were you there? 4
years.
And then where did you go from there?
It was Christmas Eve, 2000, and maybe it was Christmas Eve 2000. I can't remember. Bill Weld had just been elected governor.
Actually, we're in the 1990s, aren't we?
Yes, we are. Yeah. Yes, we are in the 1990s. Maybe it was 1990 or it was 1991. I can't remember.
Okay.
But he had just been elected and was going to take office in January, and it was Christmas Eve, and I get a phone call, and he says, "So, Bob, would you like to be my chief legal counsel?" And I said, "What?" He said, "Would you like to be my chief legal counsel?" And I said, "Well, hold on, let me talk to my wife." And I put the phone down, and I said, It's Bill Weld. He wants to know if I'll be his chief legal counsel. What? I said, "Yes, Bill, I will be happy to do that. I will need a couple of months to, dispose of and, redistribute my private practice." He says, "No, Bob, I need you in 2 weeks." So I moved a lot of things around really quickly and became his chief legal counsel.
What a great opportunity. Now, first of all, that's an incredibly important position and challenging position to be a governor's chief legal counsel. But it also, I think, may have represented the first time you took a big pay cut, I'm assuming, to go do that work. But tell me about, well, first of all, how long were you with him as chief legal counsel?
Pretty much 3 years, 24/7. That's the nature. Nature of that business.
So what was that like for you?
Oh, it was fabulous. I mean, I learned so much. It's where politics, policy, and law sort of all collide.
Yeah.
And Bill Weld gave me a lot of responsibility. We literally met almost every morning and talked with other members of his close sort of senior staff to talk about the issues of the day, issues of the week. There was no handbook as to how to be the chief legal counsel. So you sort of learned how you had to relate to the cabinet secretaries, how they had to relate to you, what your role was in preparing legislation that the governor wanted or reviewing legislation that cabinet secretaries wanted to file, doing important work on the area of judicial appointments, overseeing the Judicial Nominating Commission, which the governor appointed, and then getting the candidates that they were recommending, doing background investigations, and then making recommendations to the governor. It was a very, 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 very demanding job. You're just constantly learning how government worked and how it didn't work. And I worked with great people. I hired 2 young lawyers, one of whom, David Lowy, took my place on the Supreme Judicial Court when I retired.
Yeah.
And another one, Scott Cathcart, who's also on the Supreme Judicial Court. They're my 2 young lawyers.
So it's like what I was saying earlier about, having your champions. I mean, they followed the wake of greatness just like you did. So you were there for 3 years working with Governor Weld. And is that when you went back into private practice, the end of that 3 years?
3 years is pretty much standard. I don't know many legal counsels that have lasted more than 3 years.
It takes a lot of stamina to last that long.
Oh, it really is 24/7.
Yeah.
Crisis management constantly. it's incredibly wonderful work to be able to do because you really are making a difference every single day.
Yeah.
Which is really terrific. So at the end of 3 years, I had agreed. My wife had forced me to agree that I would begin looking around to go back into private practice.
Sure.
And I did. And I started looking, and I looked at a number of firms, and was recruited at McDermott Will and Emery.
Right. The Boston office of a major international, what was becoming at the time a major international law firm.
Well, the Boston office hadn't been around for too long. Harvey Freistadt, of course, was the founder and the managing partner. And
right.
I remember he, after hiring me, one of the first days, he goes, "So, Bob, I'd like to see your business plan." I said, "My what?" I don't have a business plan. I'm waiting for people to call. If they call, I'll be there.
So. And they did call. That's the key. Yeah, you may remember I was there in 1988, and I was there before you started and after you left. But you were there a good long time.
Almost 7 years.
And you became head of the office before
Correct.
you left. So you were as I recall it, and this is just an unvarnished view. I'm not trying to overstate it, but you became very busy. You were part of a growing white-collar criminal practice that the firm had. I know you were doing major civil litigation too. And, that firm was becoming more and more profitable. It was an extremely profitable firm, and the partners there did very well by and large. And I'm sure you were doing extremely well because I know how highly regarded you were. You couldn't have become head of that office unless people had enormous trust and confidence in you. And then you left and took another pay cut.
Yeah. Well, my experience at McDermott Will and Emery during that period of time was really wonderful.
Yeah.
The firm was expanding. I think we grew the Boston office from 40 lawyers to 120.
Yes.
I was named to the management committee and then the executive committee, and was involved in opening the London office, and really, really, really learned a lot about big firm management and the practice of law as it was developing in that arena.
You had an opportunity. You had a golden opportunity.
I never wanted to be a judge.
Yeah.
It's not something that I had this great ambition. That's what I want to be. When I was the governor's legal counsel, of course, I spent a lot of time. We appointed almost 100 judges. And I had reviewed the backgrounds of all of them, made recommendations. So I got to know a lot more about the judiciary and being a judge through them. And then when I left the governor's office, I became the chair for a while of the Judicial Nominating Committee for several years. Then I sort of left that, and there were a couple of vacancies on the SJ, on the Supreme Judicial Court. And Governor Cellucci asked me if I would be interested in filling one of those vacancies. And I have to say, it was hard to say no to that. It really was.
Well, it's such an important position. Again, I think when most people look at that, they think, well, of course, he's going to take such a prestigious job. Anybody would. You'd have to be crazy to turn it down. But what most people don't realize is it comes with a great financial sacrifice.
Yeah.
Because I used to know what Massachusetts judges made, and they're just not paid what they could be making in private practice, and so you obviously again chose public service at some financial cost to yourself, but what came with that, of course, was a very rewarding number of years. You were at the pinnacle of the legal profession in Massachusetts on a great court and a historic court. It's just interesting to follow different people's choices and different people's careers, because I don't know of many people who would turn that down, but I also know it's got to be a hard decision for people who are doing very well in private practice, and they're not independently wealthy, and they have to make a choice. Am I willing to make this financial sacrifice to do this job? You did. I don't want to overplay that because, again, it would be a hard position to turn down. Not very many people have that opportunity. It's prestigious and it's very selective. So
I must say, when I was Bill Weld's legal counsel, Bill gave a number of assignments to me with respect to the judiciary. A, recruit more women into the judiciary. B, recruit more minorities into the judiciary.
good.
We know there are qualified, capable people out there, but they don't think the door's open to them. So I spent a lot of time doing that, which was incredibly rewarding that we were able to dramatically increase, particularly the number of women in the Superior Court and the other courts. But there were a lot of great folks that just said, I can't make that sacrifice.
Yeah.
I just can't. And I understood that. And for me, the ability to make the sacrifice, because it was about an 85% pay cut, was really enabled by my work at McDermott, Will and Emery.
Yeah.
I was able to set aside money for my children's education and at least know that I was prepared to face that and to take care of that.
Yeah.
And that helped me make the decision.
Good. Well, I'm grateful that you did. So you were on the bench, was it 13 years?
No, 16, almost
16 years. And, I knew some of the justices that you served with. It was quite a strong bench and really interesting people, also committed to public service like you were. Just briefly, how would you describe that experience?
It was amazing. People, high quality, high caliber people with lots of different experiences sitting around the table, speaking honestly, listening carefully. The collaboration was incredible. That doesn't mean we always agreed, but we always listened carefully, responded thoughtfully. I just can't tell you how special that was. And so almost 16 years, great colleagues, great law clerks. That was something that, I had at least 2 law clerks at all times, and I never had to bill a client for their work, and spend a lot of time really hashing over really important issues. I mean, the SJC, the Supreme Judicial Court, makes a lot of law. I mean, the case come there because there's a very important reason, either a very important dispute or an inconsistency or the need to square away something. So they were all really wonderful things to work on.
And I will say, without singling any cases out, there were some very important decisions made during the time you were on the bench. And I know you were not always in the majority in those decisions.
No.
But every time you wrote a dissent, it was very well thought out, very well articulated, and your position was always, in my mind, the epitome of reason. And I may not have agreed with all of them all the time, or I may have, and then later came to disagree. But you brought a lot of thoughtfulness to the bench, and I think it's important for any court to have that kind of dialectic among the judges who compose the court.
I agree, and we had great people on the court.
Yeah,
we worked very hard to get consensus, but when we didn't, there were good reasons for it, and everybody understood that.
Right, and respected each other for it.
Yes, for sure, absolutely.
So I don't have the timetable in front of me, but you left the bench in what year?
2016, September, I think, of 2016.
Okay.
I participated in about 4,000 decisions.
You weren't yet at mandatory retirement age, right? You were a year or two shy of it?
Yeah. Oh, yes. No, I was not at mandatory retirement.
Which is 70 in Massachusetts.
Correct. But I had served 16 years, almost 16, participated in about 4,000 decisions, wrote about 450 opinions.
Wow.
Read about 12,000 briefs. And I had a wonderful time, but I felt it was time for me to move on.
Yeah. And so you ended up back at McDermott.
I did.
Okay. Which is where you are now. And in fact, you're speaking to me from McDermott's office on Clarendon Street in the old Hancock building, right?
Yes, I am.
Okay. So I want to move on to something else. And I think it started shortly after you became a judge on the SJC. And that is the work you've been doing overseas, involving the rule of law and democracy and the courts, the independence of the judiciary. And you told me this story, and I knew some of it before, but not much. And I know when we talked before, you told me it all started with a phone call you got from a clerk in the court who said there were some Russian judges who wanted to meet a Massachusetts judge. Can you sort of pick it up from there and tell us how you got started in this work that you're still continuing today in maybe a different form or capacity in Ukraine now, but it started out with work you were doing with Russian judges?
Yes, the call was from a court officer. I was in the library. I think I was the only judge working that day. And I met with the Russian judges. We spent all afternoon talking. I really was not fully aware of what was going on in Russia. I knew, after the Soviet Union collapsed, there were efforts to create a constitutional democracy, but I hadn't followed that at all. And they were actually on the Constitutional Court, and they were going to visit the U.S. Supreme Court to talk, to ask them how they got states to comply with their decisions. Obviously, it could be a problem. And but we spent all afternoon talking, and I really began to ask most of the questions about what was going on in Russia. I was incredibly interested and inspired by it.
And to put it in time context again, I think this was in 2001.
2001.
So it was during the period when I think Putin was president of Russia, but there was still an attempt for Russia to maintain ties with the West, as I understand.
Oh, very much so. In fact, yeah. Attempts to grow ties, and in order to do that, they had to establish that they had a judiciary that was independent and reliable and fair. And so this was one of the great challenges of the Russian judiciary, was to sort of recreate itself, move to an adversarial justice system, judicial independence, a whole variety of things. Several months after my meeting, and this was in the summer of 2001, I helped Massachusetts, the judiciary, become a member of the Russian American Rule of Law Consortium, which was a group of 10 states, really founded by a justice on the Supreme Court of Vermont. And we were funded by USAID, State Department, to partner with different regions of Russia to work with them on everything from judicial ethics, judicial independence, judicial training, and even jury trials, which is what they were trying to eventually evolve to. We were partnered with Siberia.
Okay.
So I got my first introduction to Siberia, and it was an interesting introduction.
Yeah.
We worked very hard with them. I was there many, many times. I also got to Moscow and St. Petersburg and other places because we had national meetings all over the country. And we brought many delegations here. Our aim was to try to get lawyers, prosecutors, and judges to realize that they were the three legs to the stool, and they had to work together to create a better system.
They were trying to learn from the U.S. legal system and from the judicial system in particular,
yes.
And trying to become an independent judiciary, which is not what they had been under communism, I gather.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. And I remember, I just have this recollection, and we don't need to spend time on this, but I just remember one day you called me and you decided to bring a group of Russian judges, I think, over to McDermott, and I don't know who else met with them and tried to answer some of their questions about our court system. So that's the only exposure I ever had to it until talking with you now. But it was clear to me that a lot of what they were hearing about our judicial system was new to them. It was strange to them, but they very much wanted to learn about it.
They did. And my approach has always been, I'm not there to dictate anything. I'm there to share.
Yeah.
It's been our experience. Some of it's worked, some of it hasn't. What are the challenges you face? How can we be helpful? I'm not there to tell them what to do. And that's always been my approach, and it's worked very well.
So now you continued making these trips and working with this group for a number of years, but at some point it came to a halt. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Right. I mean, I was able to bring lots of judges and lawyers to Siberia, and obviously to engage them with the delegations that came to Boston, of which there were many. We always insisted that lawyers, judges, and prosecutors come as part of the same group because we kept trying to emphasize that they had to work together. This was important to all of them. In any event, after about 8 years, things began to surface about corruption in the highest levels of government, and particularly with Mr. Putin. And he literally shut it down.
Yeah.
He basically prohibited American judges from going to Russia, prohibited Russian judges from going to America. He really decided that he did not need an independent judiciary. Thank you very much. Russia was doing very well. The price of oil was high. They didn't really need Western capital anymore. I believe that's what he thought. And it shut down. And free press, there had been a rising of an independent media. That was all put to bed. And that's where we are. It happened just like that, just in a heartbeat.
What happened to the judges that you had met?
Well, I've had virtually no contact with them at all.
Okay. But then around the same time that ended, or maybe it was a year later or so, you got another call, this time involving Turkey.
Right. Well, in the interim, while I was still working for Russia, or with Russia, I should say, I was asked to go to Kosovo to work with the judiciary there. They were about to declare their independence, and they really wanted to make sure they had a judiciary that understood what their function was. And then I was also asked to go to the Gambia, which is in Western Africa, by the embassy there, to also work on issues of judicial independence and free press. So I had these other little experiences along the way. And in 2010, I get a call, as you suggested, that there were some Turkish judges that were visiting Boston and wanted to speak to an American judge. And I said, of course, that would be great. And I learned that they had just begun to send literally 10 judges and their families to the US for 10 months to learn English and also to sort of learn a little bit more about the American system of justice, but they had not coordinated with anybody. So they were just leaving, but wanted to see if I could help coordinate more interaction with the judiciary for the next group that was coming in. And I said, absolutely. And so that began a great relationship.
And that began another project of yours that went on for a few years, right?
Big project. I brought lots of judges. We were invited to go to the Turkish Judicial Academy in Ankara, and I brought Judge Wolf, Judge Stearns. I brought all kinds of state and federal judges. We were there in 2012, spent a week there, had a great time, really learned a lot. They created this academy because Turkey, of course, wanted to be a member of the EU, and they needed to have an independent judiciary, a reliable judiciary, and they need to demonstrate that. So this was really an important moment in time. They asked me to come back and focus on free speech, which was interesting, under the Turkish Constitution and the American Constitution. So we had another big go-around, another week in 2013 as well. And it was pretty spectacular.
And then what happened with that?
As happened in Russia, information began to circulate about corruption in Mr. Erdogan's family and cabinet and the like. Erdogan began to try to shut down Twitter, tried to shut down YouTube, and the Constitutional Court of Turkey said, no, that violates the free speech clause of our Constitution. You can't do that. He was furious. He then took control of the High Council of Justice, which ran the judiciary. He had legislation changed so he could take control, and then began to have the High Council of Justice move all the judges all around. Judges that were not viewed as cooperative with him got transferred, and things got really, really bad. Yeah. He was clearly trying to get control of the judiciary, and ultimately, I went back in 2015. I was asked to speak at the 70th anniversary of one of their Supreme Courts, and actually brought the dean of BC Law School with me and a few others. And we were told what was going on there. And in 2016, the next year, of course, there was an alleged coup, and Erdogan had over 3,000 judges arrested and imprisoned, seized all of their assets, shut down the Justice Academy in Ankara, and basically jailed reporters. I mean, exactly the same thing. He went after the free press and the independent judiciary.
And that was the end of your work there.
Oh, that was the end of my work there. I can't even go back there.
Okay. That had to be tremendously disappointing, but it did seem to follow a very similar pattern to what had happened in Russia as well.
It did. Two autocrats taking control.
You wrote a paper, well, you gave a talk at BC Law School, I guess, Boston College Law School. You sent me a copy of it. It's the Rappaport Lecture. Your talk was entitled Challenges to Constitutional Democracy, Lessons from Abroad, and the date on it was September 5th of 2018, so that wasn't long after you had been forced to leave Turkey. I want to read just a couple portions of this because I think it's extremely interesting and disturbing too, concerning. First of all, though, I just want to say in your opening paragraph, I picked up on something. You have your last sentence is, and this is neither here nor there, but your last sentence is, constitutional democracy, so conceived and constructed, has been the foundation of our security and prosperity. I detected a little hint of Abraham Lincoln in that. It sounds a little bit like one of his lines from the Gettysburg Address.
It's entirely possible.
Okay. But here's what you say on the next page, and I think this probably sums up a lot of your talk. Your talk was very focused on the interrelationship between an independent judiciary and a free press and how they rely on each other, very much so. And if you lose those, you lose democracy. So now I'm just going to quote you. The rise of constitutional democracies and the global institutions they created produced an unprecedented period of peace and prosperity in Europe. And while the trend line towards freedom through democracy 25 years ago seemed so positive in Eastern Europe, Africa, South America, and elsewhere, it has now turned dismal. According to the Economist's Democracy Index, 89 countries regressed in 2017 and only 27 improved. And Freedom House reports that for the 12th consecutive year, countries suffering decline in political rights and civil liberties have drastically outnumbered those registering gains. Can you talk a little bit about that, Bob, and also about where free speech, freedom of the press, really, the free press and the independence of the judiciaries, how they are sort of the pillars that you're focused on for a free democracy?
Well, I mean, this is all just context in which I was working at the time, and important to sort of understand. It is, I have to say, when I got involved with the international legal community, it was really quite something. All of a sudden, it became apparent to me that we actually could help countries that wanted to move towards a fairer system of justice that would be respected and trusted by their citizens and applauded in the international community, which had so emphasized the protection of human rights and liberties as a cornerstone of modern constitutional democracy. And for the first time in my life, I realized that I actually had something that I could offer. I mean, if there was any regret I had about not becoming an engineer, is that if you're an engineer, you can take that talent anywhere in the world and build a water treatment plant, a sewage treatment plant, or this or that. But if you're an American lawyer in the 70s and 80s, that was it. There was no marketplace beyond that. And all of a sudden, the international community, Russia, Turkey, and others, were looking towards the United States and our system to understand it better. And all of a sudden, there was something we could offer. And that was really quite wonderful. The sad news is that how fragile that all was. And Russia and Turkey are two incredible examples of what an autocrat can do. The playbook is to cripple the free press and the independent judiciary, and then run the country as you choose to run it, which is exactly what's going on in both of those countries.
Yeah.
So this is context. One of the other experiences that I had, and probably my most intense experience was with Uzbekistan. In 2012, I was contacted and basically told that they understood I would go anywhere and do anything for rule of law. And they wanted me to come to Uzbekistan to speak at the 20th anniversary of their constitution, which I did. And they had a constitutional democracy which was run by an autocrat. But there was an effort to try to open things up. And I was asked to come in and to help with that process, which I did. I've been there 12, 13 times and have sent dozens of delegations of judges and lawyers and others there, and hosted many delegations here. That experience was very different. That is my one major positive experience. After the autocrat passed away, someone else came into power who actually had in mind opening the country up. And to do that, he needed to support an independent judiciary. He needed support free press, civil society, and it has worked remarkably well. We've got lawyers now working with prosecutors and judges in teams to improve their criminal justice system, criminal procedures, civil procedures, and all of that has been extraordinary. But I know how fragile it is and how a turn of events can change everything. So I don't know what else I can add to that, except at least there's one place I know that I, me and others have made a difference in a positive way.
Well, that's great. It's just so important, and we here in the United States take all of that so much for granted.
Oh, we do. When I used to come back from these trips, I totaled it up the other day. I actually took 35 international trips to 10 different countries.
Wow.
To work with judiciaries there, and I used to come back all the time and say, "Thank God I'm home." Boy, do we have so much to be thankful for.
Yeah, I mean, none of it's perfect, right? We see assaults on free press, and we see that there are good judges and bad judges, but by and large, we've got a pretty great system, and most Americans today, or at least large numbers of them, don't necessarily understand how good we have it and appreciate how important all of that is.
That's true.
And I want to get into that in a minute, but let me ask you before I do. So all of this work you were doing while you were on the bench, it's not part of the job description for a Supreme Judicial Court justice. How did your colleagues, I think I know the answer to this, but I haven't heard you say it. How did your colleagues feel about all the trips you were taking and all the work you were doing that didn't involve writing opinions for the Supreme Judicial Court?
People have asked me that now that I left the court, other people have come onto the court, and they ask, how the hell did you do all of that?
Yeah.
Gee, there's so much work here.
Because you still wrote a lot of opinions. I mean, you told me that earlier on.
No. Nobody lightened my load, but I really cared about this so deeply. And one thing about being on the court is you can literally plan your whole year. You know when arguments are going to be, you know when the briefs are going to be coming in, you know when the court meetings are. It's all scheduled. So you can work very much around that. In the summers, we didn't have sittings in the summers.
Right.
We were trying to complete all of our drafts and get ready for the following fall. So there was time, but I got to tell you, my wife reminds me frequently that I wasn't around much.
Yeah.
It really wasn't. And not that I would do it any differently, but I do regret that.
Yeah. Well, let's talk about Ukraine.
Yeah.
So you are now active in I'm forgetting the name of it, the Ethics Council
Of the Judiciary of the Ukraine.
Okay. Tell us about that work. How long have you been doing it, and what
Sure.
does it entail?
A little background. I was invited in 2015 to go to Kyiv to speak at a judicial reform conference, a legal reform conference. I brought actually Judge Patty Saris with me.
Yeah. Federal judge in Boston. Yeah.
Federal judge. She was the chief judge at the
Okay.
time. She had family from Ukraine and was interested in trying to find their village. And so she jumped on the opportunity to come, which was wonderful.
Great.
And I learned a lot about what was the challenges in Ukraine by spending a week or so there. I was asked to come back in 2016, and I did, and made a lot of presentations about judicial independence and free press, this sort of interdependent nature, and they appreciated that very much. And then in was it November of 2021? Yes, November of 2021, I was asked if I would accept an appointment to the Ethics Council of the Judiciary of the Ukraine, which had just been established as part of a multifaceted effort to reform the judiciary of Ukraine, to eliminate corruption from the judiciary, if at all possible. And it was a vitally important thing to their being admitted to the EU and getting status that would even put them into consideration.
Yeah.
So this was set up. The EU was deeply supportive of this. This was a really important piece of legislation. It was set up with 3 senior Ukrainian judges and 3 international experts, quote unquote. And I was asked if I would be one of those internationals. And I could not have said no. I would not have said no. So the State Department nominated me. The World Bank seconded the nomination, and I was appointed, along with the former Attorney General of Estonia, an incredibly talented woman, and a retired judge from Wales, appeals court judge from Wales, who had served on lots of commissions over there, including the commission that established the Anti-Corruption Court. And he was highly regarded. He's like 83 or 84 years old, and he's the most incredible person I've ever met. We all met in November of 2021. We hired staff, we got office space, we got to know each other, and we began our work. Our work was to reform the High Council of Justice. In the Ukraine, the High Council of Justice completely runs the judiciary, from the appointment of judges, the disciplining of judges, the assignment of judges, the standards that judges have to meet. It's all done by the High Council of Justice.
It's not like one of our high courts where the people on it are judges that are also sitting on cases. They're full-time administrators of the court system.
Well, but many of them are judges.
Oh, are they? Are they still hearing cases though?
No, I don't believe they are.
Okay.
So the High Council of Justice is 21 people. 10 of them are nominated by the conference of judges, and 2 or 3 are nominated by the president, and then the Congress of academics and the Congress of defense lawyers. Everybody has a little piece of this. But in order to be appointed by any of these appointing parties, the applicants had to pass our tests. That was the whole point. We had to review the current sitting members, their backgrounds, to determine whether they meet at the standards of professional ethics and integrity. And then we had to basically review the nominees from these various entities, and they could only appoint someone that passed our review. What happened was, literally, this is before the war broke out, when we said we were going to begin reviewing the backgrounds of the sitting members, 12 of them resigned in order to avoid having their backgrounds investigated. And there had been a number of vacancies, so there were only 4 people, so it was dysfunctional, and we had a lot of work to do. And of course, we had planned to do all of these interviews in Kyiv, and then the war broke out and changed everything.
Yeah.
We have procedures, we have a methodology, we had to adopt those, and there are now 17 members of the High Council of Justice. We've interviewed probably over 110, 120 people, done extensive background investigations on all of them. We have the National Anti-Corruption Bureau working for us. Civil society provides enormous amounts of information about the candidates. We probably have approved maybe 20% of the candidates that have been sent to us. It's not a big number. but it's enough that the High Council has now got 17 members, which means it's functional for the first time in a really long time. And the whole notion was to ensure that that High Council of Justice, of the highest integrity, and would definitely take on corruption within the judicial system. Historically, it had been accused of protecting corrupt judges, and we needed to change that. And that's what we've been doing. We interview candidates. We start at 3 a.m. Kyiv time, which is 10 a.m. 10 a.m. Kyiv time, which is 3 a.m. Boston time.
Oh, gee.
Go for 8 hours, 3 or 4 interviews at a time.
Yeah.
And we, as I say, we have tremendous amounts of material. I have 3 assistants working for me in Kyiv, 3 young lawyers, fantastic Ukrainian lawyers.
How much longer do you expect to be involved in that?
Well, when we started out, they were hoping that this would be done in 6 to 8 months. And of course, that was 15 months ago.
Yeah.
Nobody expected a war to break out. Nobody expected everybody to resign. It's a good thing they did resign, frankly. We're very close to being done. We probably have another round. We just announced. The president's nominees have just been announced, the ones we've approved, and now we have the Council of Academics. I would suggest another month or 2. It will be done.
It's an interesting thing from an outsider's perspective, because all we hear about Ukraine now is the war. Yeah. And we forget that their life is still going on for the people who stayed in Ukraine. What's going on with their courts? Are court cases still being heard? Are there trials? Or is everything at a standstill because of the war right now?
No, I don't think everything's at a standstill at all. Obviously, in the eastern part of Ukraine, there's a war going on, so that changes everything. But in the rest of Ukraine, I mean, there is a judiciary. One of the results of a dysfunctional High Council of Justice is there are 2,000 vacancies on the judiciary.
Wow.
2,000 vacancies.
Are there even enough lawyers to fill that many vacancies?
I would hope so. But
I hope so.
It's a very highly educated country. The people are terrific. Obviously, they're very brave, and they know they have to go on.
Yeah.
So the judiciary has sort of done the best it could, but it's got to become respected and trusted, and that requires reform from top to bottom. And so I think we've got the top reformed. The bottom is being reformed, or will be reformed over the next couple of years. And that's really important. There will be a country after this war, and the judiciary will be a very important part of it. And if they want EU membership, they have to demonstrate that they have done everything possible to create a non-corrupt, independent judiciary and a criminal justice system and a civil justice system, which is fair and just and respected.
We've talked about the importance of the independent judiciary and the free press as kind of played out in Russia and Turkey, and fighting corruption, weeding out corruption as you're doing now in Ukraine. Uzbekistan sounds like a great success story. But bringing it all back home, how concerned are you about the strength of our own democracy and the press and the judiciary in particular, which of course is your expertise? It's been a rough few years. Democracy has been, some would say, and I would agree with it, has been under attack at very high levels.
Yeah.
What do you think about what's going on in this country today, and how hopeful are you?
Well, I try not to think about it all that much because it is very distressing.
Yeah.
Collaboration is extremely important. We have really wonderful institutions, the judiciary being one of them, although I must say it varies from state to state.
Yeah.
Some of these electoral campaigns going on in some of these states makes me physically ill. But we have a lot to be grateful for. And to see some of this falling apart at the seams, to see all of this hate, lack of collaboration, it's very distressing. And the courts have lost a lot of respect, particularly the Supreme Court of the United States, which is unfortunate. Yeah. They were always really one of the most respected institutions in government. They've lost some of that, I think, in part for good reason, which is terrible. So I worry. I worry. People have to come together. They have to appreciate that we really have a lot that people around the rest of the world don't have, and we need to save it. And that's really important. And everyone has to take it on, either by voting or by having their voices heard, or by supporting those who ensure that this will continue.
What would you say to any lawyers or law students who are listening to this podcast about what they can and should do to step up and protect our democracy?
Well, I think what I can say is that they need to consider that. It's an important part. There's a wonderful quote, which I will try to find in a second, from de Tocqueville, which is my favorite quote. And the reason this quote strikes me, and the reason it helps answer your question, lawyers have a very important role to play in protecting and ensuring the continuation of our constitutional democracy. And de Tocqueville, this is one of his observations, which I think is so important. It reads as follows: "The authority that Americans and their laws have entrusted to members of the legal profession, and the influence which these individuals exercise in the government, is the most powerful existing security against its excesses."
Against its excesses. Okay.
Lawyers have a role to play, and that's an important. You don't just become a lawyer to go out and do practice little things over here. You're a part of this important community, and you have a role to play in ensuring the success, the continued success of a constitutional democracy, which requires an independent judiciary and a free press, two critical components of that constitutional democracy.
Well, this has been a fascinating conversation. You've obviously been doing some of the most interesting work of anybody I know, at least. What's ahead for you? You're going to continue doing the work in Ukraine. You're still at McDermott, but are you ever going to slow down?
Well, I'm certainly going to change course. I mean, I've done this a few times in my life. I'm about to turn 74. I've got 3 little grandchildren now, so that has caught my attention.
Congratulations.
Make up for lost time. I will continue to work for various nonprofit entities that are doing important work in our country. I'm sure I just got a message yesterday from Uzbekistan saying, "Bob, can you come over 2 weeks from now to speak to the Congress about the constitutional amendments they're considering? They mentioned you by name. Could you please come?" And I said, I can't come. So I may have to go back to Uzbekistan once or twice.
Yeah.
But no, I want to spend more time in the mountains because I love the mountains, and enjoying my life a little bit, and continue to stay engaged.
But it's all been a labor of love for you. I haven't heard of anything you've ever done that you did grudgingly. It sounds like everything you've done has been very rewarding and fulfilling, and I'm sure a lot of that is because of who you are, but also because it is rewarding to do work in the public service. You're trying to make the world a better place.
It is.
I just wish everybody understood early in their careers how important and fulfilling and rewarding that can be. So
all of that is true, and I have been incredibly fortunate. I like to say I had no life plan, but I just was able to just take and grow and do things that I really look back on and say, that was great. That was great.
Well, you're a great role model for people considering law and considering international work. And thank you for all you've done for Massachusetts and for the world. And I hope you do get some time to enjoy the mountains in between your trips to Uzbekistan and Poland and everywhere else in the world. So, Bob, thank you. It's been really great to catch up with you. It's been a long time since you and I have talked, and certainly at this level, it's been a very long time. And it's just great to connect with you again. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Don. And I think it's wonderful what you're doing. I really do. This is so exciting. It's so great.
I really enjoy it. And there's just a lot of really good people doing great things out there. And we don't hear from them that much. Most of them are too humble or modest to talk about themselves. So I have to help them. Thank you very much, and you take care.
This has been an episode of Higher Callings. Your host is Donald Federico. Music is provided by Fancy Mountain, and our logo was designed by Matt Pedro. The associate producer is Brian Federico. Higher Callings is a production of Federico Media, LLC.